Hello everyone, thank you for attending today's webinar, Perceptions, Myths and New Thinking on Direct-to-Patient Clinical Supply, presented by Catalent. I'm Nick Taylor. I'll be moderating this webinar and presenting a brief analysis of some recent survey data. After that, we'll be hearing from Nicole Gray, Director, Strategic Supply Solutions at Catalent Pharma Solutions. You can read Nicole's full bio on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours of the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Question and Answer tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. To start, I'm going to present a few slides outlining current thinking about direct-to-patient distribution. The slides are based on the findings of a survey of more than 200 people involved in clinical supply and operations. As you'll see, DTP has become a crucial part of how these people run studies. This first chart shows responses to a question about the importance of DTP to study execution. It shows almost 2/3 of people see DTP as important to successful study execution. Around 30% of people see DTP as very important. That finding is echoed in a question focused on the US market. Here we see that most people think it is important to be able to offer DTP in the US. More than 40% of respondents answered very important to that question. The situation in Europe is more complicated. Companies need country-level approval to run DTP trials in Europe, and the survey suggests this may be affecting use of the approach in the region. The chart on the left shows people think DTP is important in Europe, but the case is less clear-cut than in the US. Around 25% of people said DTP is very important in Europe, compared to around 40% in the US. On the right, we have responses to a question about how the European rules affect DTP. What we see is around 40% of people, represented by the orange column, only use DTP in key European countries because of the approval requirements. Another 18% of people don't do DTP in any European countries. That brings me to the end of the survey analysis. With that, I'll now hand over to Nicole for the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining today's webinar. I'm very excited to speak to you all about direct-to-patient and hopefully be able to answer some or all of your questions. Just a note that I am fighting a cold at the moment, so please excuse me if I need to mute my phone here and there. I'll be sipping on some tea as I go. I was in Disney World last week, and although I did intend to bring a souvenir home, this is not what I had in mind. So again, please excuse me if I sound a little scratchy or have a little coughing. So basically, I'd like to start with what is direct-to-patient and what is site-to-patient. So when we talk about the basics of direct-to-patient, as I'm sure you know, the industry has been referring to direct-to-patient as all-inclusive, meaning direct-to-patient either from a clinical site or from a pharmacy or in some cases a depot. I would like to separate these two and make it clear that when I refer to site-to-patient, I mean site-to-patient where the clinical site arranges and ships that product to the patient's home. And for direct-to-patient, I mean we bypass the clinical site altogether and ship the product directly from a depot or a pharmacy to the patient's home. It's important to note that protocols should include direct or site-to-patient in order to accommodate for certain patients or for emergencies. I have heard that there are waivers possible for one-off shipments, but this could become complicated and cumbersome compared to planning up front. So again, what is direct-to-patient? It's the ability to ship clinical trial supplies to a patient's home as part of a traditional site-based model or a fully decentralized trial. And DTP and site-to-patient can apply to all shipments for all patients, some shipments for all patients, some shipments for some patients, or in emergency situations only. And the DTP model can and should be flexible depending on the protocol and your specific patient needs. So why is direct-to-patient important to patients? So when we think about the overall clinical trial network, less than 5% of the current population takes part in a clinical trial, given the way that those trials are currently structured. patients really would desire an alternative to traditional site visits. And in the 2014 ISDE study, explored patient attitudes towards home delivery options for repeat prescriptions or refills in clinical trials. Approximately 78% of all those patients indicated it would be very helpful to have their medication delivered right to their home versus traveling to a clinical site. And this option obviously was much more popular with the younger population, meaning they're probably more comfortable with technology, but that doesn't mean that DTP and or decentralized trials are impossible with an older patient population. We'll just need to keep this in mind when setting up how we set up e-visits and how they're conducted, and the ease of use of the technology for the patient. An older patient population may benefit or enjoy some more face-to-face interaction via home health care visits or a visit to a local doctor's office. But again, not impossible, depending on your population. So again, why is DTP important to patients? So obviously, it's a very patient-centric approach. It takes into account the patient's quality of life, removes some of the degree of complexity and burden of participating in a clinical trial. It supports patients who have long and difficult travel to a clinical site. So think about if you're very ill and you live in New Jersey, but there's a clinical trial available to you in California. It takes away the need for you to uproot your entire family and your whole life to be able to participate in that trial. And vice versa. It could be you live in California and the trial's in New Jersey. Another thing to keep in mind is it may prevent missed treatment doses and then transporting drugs. Think about how hard we all, work to make sure that drug is kept within GMP conditions, proper drug storage, proper temp monitoring all through the supply chain. But then when we hand the drug to a patient at the doctor's office and they go home, they're stopping at a grocery store, leaving that in the car. That product's probably no longer 2 to 8 or controlled room temperature. So this would help with that as well. And then think about just people like us on this call. We work, we have children, we have families. So in order to rearrange our schedules and our lives to fit in a face-to-face visit at a site that may not be local to us makes it very difficult. So obviously having our drug delivered at home makes things much more convenient. So what are the important benefits to clinical sponsors and sites? Obviously, if your trial is, on one part of the country and your patient population is in another, it eliminates the need to have so many physical site locations, and it broadens that patient access and the demographics available to the trial. It opens up trial participation to patients in remote areas. So even if it is within your state, doesn't mean it's not 2 or 3 hours away where you would need to travel to see the investigator, and reduces geographic barriers. Assists recruitment and increases access to patients with rare diseases. So sometimes our patient population, is sparse, and it would help to be able to, recruit patients from all over the country or all over the world versus just within a local region. It could help support patient compliance and adherence through e-technology. The investigator staff doesn't need to dispense the product anymore, so reduce storage burden on the clinical site. So we've all seen some kits that are huge and take up tons of shelf space within some of these smaller doctors' offices, so this would definitely help there. And it alleviates product stability concerns from site to patient's home, as we discussed earlier. And overall, it may help to decrease overall trial costs. So I know that it may not seem that way when you're thinking about carrier and technology, but when you take everything into account, it's definitely possible that it could decrease overall trial costs. So what is a decentralized trial? So centralized trials or traditional trials are conducted at designated study sites, and study procedures are generally performed by investigators and their delegated study personnel. Study subject visits take place at these study sites during face-to-face visits with those study personnel. So obviously technological advances have opened the door widely to the new DCT model, in which some or all study-related procedures take place away from the investigator site, either via telemedicine or via local healthcare providers, such as a primary care physician, a pharmacist, a clinic, a home-based healthcare, or your regional hospital or doctor's office. Decentralized trials are not new, although the industry is really starting to pick up here. It's not something new, and it has been done as early as the 1980s successfully. So hundreds of DCT trials have been conducted since its inception in the 80s. These trials have been both hybrid models and 100% decentralized. And with the advancement in technology, the potential is virtually unlimited and improving constantly. Smartphones, tablets, web browsers, access to televisits, and electronic records are making it easier for patients and study staff to communicate and stay in touch in real time. An investigator based in California can treat a patient in Iowa and so on. Home health care providers, nurses, mobile phlebotomists, and other local health care providers are all part of this solution. The investigator remains the lead medical professional that conducts a clinical trial, so that doesn't change in the DCT. It is under the investigator's lead that the drug is dispensed and administered to the patient. So none of that, including patient safety and who takes responsibility for the patient care, changes in a DCT versus the traditional model. It's always the investigator. So in a decentralized trial, even if no patients ever physically visit the investigator site, there is still a clinical site. So we shouldn't necessarily say siteless or virtual, because there has to be an address where the investigator is located and licensed to practice medicine and conduct a clinical trial. To reiterate, the site is the address of the investigator, and that is where the investigator conducts, oversees, and coordinates all DCT-related activities. So what does the FDA think about decentralized trials and direct-to-patient? So the FDA has stated in multiple press releases and statements that it is in full support of DCTs and expanding a patient access through digital health technology. The FDA has produced a lot of guidance to date on DCTs. Some are mentioned here on the slide and some are not, but just for example, in 2007, the FDA mentioned computerized systems used in clinical investigations. It gave guidance there. E-source data in clinical investigations in 2013. The use of electronic informed consent in 2016. The use of e-records and e-signatures in clinical investigations under 21 CFR Part 11 in 2017. And then digital health technologies efforts, use of mobile devices, biosensors, etc., and wearable devices. So in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law, and that intended to help accelerate product development and get new drugs to patients that need them faster and more efficiently. So the FDA is totally in favor of modernizing clinical trials, and it is an agency-wide priority. The regulatory requirements for clinical data integrity and patient safety, as I mentioned earlier, are the same for centralized versus traditional trials and DCT. So we always have to keep in mind patient safety at the forefront. So decentralized trials, there's a lot involved in a decentralized trial, and direct-to-patient is a small component of that. DTP and DCT do not have to be an all-or-nothing approach. It can and should be flexible. So it could be one patient in a trial, a few patients, or all patients in a trial. Starting small may be the best solution for your organization. Studies can be set up to meet the needs of the patient population and the protocol. For example, maybe the initial visit is a site visit, and the next few patient kits are shipped directly to the patient, along with televisits and study coordinator check-ins via digital health technology. Another site visit may occur if necessary after a predetermined period of time, and maybe some patients will never come to the site based on their location or their personal preference. If possible, and the trial design allows for it, give patients the choice. Would they prefer a telemedicine visit or an in-person site visit? In a DCT with geographical complexity, maybe they visit their local primary care doctor's office and have a telemedicine visit with their investigator, along with their primary care physician. There are many options, and the more options we leave open, the better the experience will be for the patient. Older patients have expressed their preference to visit sites, while younger patients prefer a 100% telemedicine experience. So again, flexibility in the protocol design is key. And just a reminder that direct-to-patient, although a big part of DCT, is just a small component when thinking about planning the entire protocol. So state regulations within the U.S., there's obviously been some disagreement within the industry, and without true guidance from the FDA or the states, there's been a lot of different interpretation of those laws. But general regulations and pharmacy-specific regulations are pretty clear. So the general regulations say that the IND drugs are covered by the CFR. However, the CFR does not preempt state laws. State laws require that only a doctor or a pharmacist dispense drugs to a patient. And when the clinical site ships to a patient's home, the doctor is the one dispensing that drug to the patient. When a pharmacy ships drugs to a patient's home, the pharmacist is dispensing the drug to the patient directly. Pharmacies must be licensed in the state in which they are shipping into and out of. And some states, on top of that, require that a pharmacist also be licensed in the state they are shipping into, and that's called a pharmacist in charge. There are currently 15 states that require this, with an additional 7 that are seriously considering it, so it should be 22 probably within a year or two. Catalent has recently taken a lot of this into account and has launched something called FlexDirect. So what FlexDirect is meant to do is be flexible in the way that the trial is set up and the way we meet patient and sponsor needs. So in order to meet the needs of the patient and customers and remain compliant to the state laws I mentioned on the earlier slide, Catalent has recently announced an on-site pharmacy within its Philadelphia packaging, storage, and distribution site. Due to the physical location of that pharmacy within the GMP storage and distribution facility, the need to split the supplies between traditional and DCT for a DTP model is eliminated. The pharmacy will be able to be completely compliant and ship direct to patients across the U.S. with oversight of a pharmacist in charge. The FlexDirect model will allow for a true mix of traditional site-to-patient and direct-to-patient shipments, or whatever combination your study or patients desire. So what's going on in the rest of the world? So I think probably most of you on this call know that most studies outside of the United States have been site-to-patient, so meaning the clinical site arranges the shipment to the patient directly. DTP is possible in Europe. It has been done, but it is very sponsor protocol and patient population dependent and requires approvals in each country. Local laws also need to be considered. For example, in France, I believe that you also need a local pharmacy to dispense within France itself. So it's highly recommended that each country have a separate supply plan in order to maintain flexibility and amend supply plans as needed, rather than having to, redo the entire protocol. The future of direct-to-patient. So DTP and STB services have benefits, as we discussed, for patients, sponsors, and clinical sites, including provision for direct-to-patient into the study protocol, provides sponsors with future flexibility, whether that be one patient, an emergency shipment, or so on, or if your plan is to do it for patients that require it. Pharmacy licensing requirements vary from state to state within the U.S. Country-specific regulations and approval processes vary from country to country in Europe and beyond. And the clinical supply partner's understanding of the DTP landscape, not just your packager and distributor, but your IVR, your CRO, and everybody, needs to be able to fully understand the landscape and has the ability to meet all requirements for compliance within applicable regulations, and that is obviously critical to the success of the trial. So that wraps up my slides for today. So thank you all very much for listening. And I think we'll go back to Nick for questions.
Thanks, Nicole. As you say, we'll now move on to Q&A. There's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left of your screen. We already have lots of great questions, so I'll start running through those now. Our first question is, does site-to-patient distribution need to be included in my protocol or just direct to patient?
So yes, the answer to that question is yes. If you're going to do site-to-patient or direct-to-patient, that should all be included in your protocol.
Okay, thanks. And the next question is, does the IRB have to approve any documents that are used for STP or DTP?
Again, the answer to that one is also yes. It may depend on your specific protocol and your setup and what documents you're using, but in most cases, the IRB will want to see patient-facing documentation, such as carrier forms that they may be signing at time of receipt, and so on.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how do you know if you are delivering to the right person?
Good question. So in most cases that I've experienced, the carrier has the person's name that they're allowed to deliver to, and they will check ID at the time of delivery. So obviously we're not going to deliver to a minor, so it may be a legal guardian or a parent that has the ability to accept that package on the patient's behalf, or it could be a home health care provider. So that can be arranged at the time of delivery, and the IDs should be checked.
Okay, great. And the next question then is, how does offering a DTP option impact IRT setup?
So for an IRT, obviously we don't want to have patient information floating around via email or anything else. So obviously you need an IRT provider that knows how to set up for direct to patient and can maintain patient privacy using patient number rather than patient name, blinding the street address, and so on. Probably a lot to consider in setting up an IRT, but if you're setting up a hybrid model, you obviously also need to take into account the need for traditional site shipments, some direct-to-patient shipments, some site-to-patient shipments, and so on. So lots to be considered there, and highly recommend that an IRT that knows how to set it up is who you go to in that case.
Moving on to our next question, it's in two parts. So, can drugs be shipped only to a patient's permanent home address, or can shipments be sent to other locations such as an office or a vacation home? And can this location change during the course of their treatment?
So yes, again, obviously would need to work with the IBR and the distributor on this, but in true DCP and DTP models, there's no reason why you cannot ship to a patient in, like my case last week, in Disney World if need be. And obviously that would need to be set up and pre-approved prior to shipment. And yes, that can change during the course of the study because patients move or, maybe on vacation or at a summer home, for example.
Right. And the next question then is, can I add a DTP option to a study that is already underway?
So yes, but you would need to amend your protocol and make sure that the vendors that you're working with can accommodate that. So it needs to be in the protocol and approved, obviously, before you can do that. But again, another reason why, even if you think you may not need it, it might be a good idea to include it up front anyway, just in case there is that need at some point during the course of the trial.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, if we ship drugs directly to patients, is it possible to reduce the number of clinical sites we need?
Yes, obviously, like I was saying earlier, if your patient is in California and your trial is being run out of an investigator site in New Jersey, you wouldn't necessarily need to open a site in California or vice versa. Obviously, with direct-to-patient, as long as your vendor can deliver to all states, it should be fine, and you shouldn't need a site in every location.
Okay, and our next question relates specifically to temperature-sensitive drugs. And it's how would you detect if there had been any damage or temperature irregularity, and what would be the remedy?
Good question. So at the time of delivery, the temp monitor should be checked, assuming it's temperature controlled. And obviously we would not deliver to a patient if the product were damaged or out of range. So when the patient signs for the shipment, the monitor is checked either by the carrier, the driver, or by a home health care provider or study staff that is at the patient's residence. And then they would call into the IRT and report that, same as they would normally, directly to the site.
Okay, I think this next question overlaps with that one somewhat, but I'll ask it anyway in case it prompts any different thoughts from you. So the question is, please discuss the temperature control process. How do you confirm temperature with DTP?
Yeah, I think it's basically the same answer. So if it's a 2 to 8 product, for example, you would include the monitor, and that monitor would be or should be checked prior to handing it over to the patient. There's a lot of new technology there with Bluetooth monitors and so on. I know Catalent, we're looking into the possibility of reading those monitors right through the box, so the package doesn't even need to be opened. before it's handed to the patient. But it would totally depend on your product and the temp monitor's use, but for the most part, it should be checked prior to be handing over to the patient.
Okay, thank you. And our next question then addresses for long-term studies. How are refills managed in this model? In the old paradigm, the participant visits the site and the site provider provides the refill after ensuring this is appropriate.
So in the pharmacy model, a new prescription from the doctor would be sent to the pharmacy so that the pharmacist could refill, quote unquote, that prescription. So because of the nature of clinical trials and patients dropping out and the possibility of a shipment request coming through that wasn't intended to come through, at least in our case, we are requiring a prescription be sent through to the pharmacy for each shipment for each patient.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you handle randomization?
So I'm not sure I quite understand that question. If I don't get it right, I'm happy to follow up. But it really doesn't change in this case. So unless I'm misunderstanding the question, there's no difference.
Okay. Well, yes, if that doesn't answer, feel free to follow us up offline, whoever asked it.
Yeah.
The next question then is, if we ship drugs directly to patients, is it possible to reduce the I think we have addressed that one, haven't we?
Yep, I think we got that one.
Yep. Does a doctor need to write a prescription and send it to the pharmacy?
So yes, in the model that Catalent has set up, definitely, and if you're following state law, yes. The doctor needs to send a prescription to the pharmacy in order for the pharmacy to dispense that product to the patient.
The next question then is, does the pharmacy have to apply a prescription label in addition to the clinical label?
So again, yes, pharmacy and state law requires that a prescription label be adhered to the shipment, not necessarily on the primary product itself, but be included with the shipment with the phone number and address of the pharmacy that is dispensing the product into the state and to that patient.
Our next question is, does the package get left on the doorstep?
So no, at least not in the model that we're looking at, and in best practice, the answer to that should be no. It should be handed directly to an authorized recipient at the time of delivery and never left on the doorstep or the porch or any other circumstance. Obviously, this is a clinical product, and we certainly would not want it to get into the hands of the wrong person.
This is another one that may overlap with some ground we've touched on previous questions. The question is, do materials need to have temperature monitors during shipping?
So, yeah, it should be the same setup as you would follow within a traditional model. If your product requires temp monitoring, then yes, it should be included and can be included via the pharmacy shipment.
The next question then is direct-to-patient via a pharmacy possible in Japan?
Okay, so currently I understand Japan law to state that it is not possible. Site-to-patient is possible. Direct-to-patient, not possible currently. However, I do believe, and I've heard, I'm not a Japan expert, but I think that for the right protocol and the right study and the right patient population, authorities may be swayed differently, because it's not so much that they're against it, it's just that the way the current rights are written doesn't allow for it. So it's not impossible, but currently not happening.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is seeking clarification on a couple of definitions. So the question is, what is the difference between site-to-patient and direct-to-patient?
So in the site-to-patient model, the distributor sends to the clinical site the same way they would in a traditional model, whether that be per patient or a full supply for that site. And all shipments from the vendor go directly to the clinical site, and the vendor has no patient information whatsoever. The clinical site then arranges directly with the carrier to have that shipment delivered to the patient's home. And they work with the carrier and the site to arrange a good delivery time and so on. In direct-to-patient, we bypass the clinical site altogether and ship directly to a patient's home.
Okay, and the next question then is, how are returns handled?
So direct from patient is what we refer to as returns in direct patient studies. So it can be set up several different ways. In a true, decentralized trial, if there are no local clinical sites, those returns can be sent directly back to the original shipper. Or if there is a clinical site, you may choose to have all returns shipped back to the clinical site or handed back to the clinical site and then packed up and sent back to your destruction vendor directly. So for pharmacy, there's no need for the pharmacy to get those returns back other than the possibility of having to remove any patient identifying data or so on. That prescription label may still be on the bottle or so on, but there's no regulation that says the pharmacy has to get them back. So it can be set up several different ways.
Okay, moving on then.
Okay.
So, yeah, the next question is, what happens if the patient discusses their treatment with the delivery person?
So in most cases, the carrier would be instructed, and they're trained never to discuss any kind of medical or treatment information with the patient directly. If that were to happen, they have protocols to follow that would, let somebody know that can talk to the patient or so on, or they'd be instructed to tell the patient, I can't have that discussion, call your doctor. But for the most part, the carriers are trained to know that they can't have that discussion. And again, it's important that your patients know who to talk to in case of any problems or medical issues. So if it's regarding delivery time or someone that's with their clinical site staff versus the carrier directly, the driver, that is.
Yep, yeah, that's clear, thank you. And then can DTP be used for drugs that require administration support, for example, infusions?
So yes, obviously you would need to set up home health care or a visit to a local regional facility for the patient to have the assistance they needed. But yes, there's no reason why it shouldn't be as long as the protocol is written to allow for it.
Thank you. The next question then is, are there certain categories of drugs, such as controlled substances, that cannot be shipped directly to patients and must be received only in a clinic?
So controlled drug. So I would say that 3 to 5 is possible. Anything other than that, probably highly unlikely. In our model, we're able to ship some controlled drug, but it would depend on the patient population, and state laws would need to be looked at for that.
Thank you. The next question then is it possible to offer a direct-to-patient option only in countries that have historically had a difficult time recruiting patients from?
Yes. So again, the key to successful DCT and DTP is flexibility. So writing your protocol to allow each country supply plan to look different is definitely highly recommended, so that you could do it in some countries and not in others.
Thank you. The next question is, what experience and solutions do you have with delivery exceptions, and such as patient not available, no ID verification, move to a new location, etc.?
So basically, how it should work is the site and the patient have a discussion about when are you available to receive shipments. If a patient is traveling, the site should be made aware of that. And that's all done through, check-ins, and whether it be face-to-face or telemedicine or through an app, the patient can rearrange delivery times as appropriate. And then as a second level, the carrier will call the patient directly and let them know that they're coming with a shipment on Wednesday between the hours of 10 and 11. Will you be there to receive it, and so on. So obviously exceptions are going to occur, but depending on the product itself and the way the protocol is designed and the agreement that's set up between the vendor, the carrier, and the sponsor, it would either the carrier would wait and redeliver, or the shipment would come back to the distributor, either for try to redeliver if possible, or to be rejected, depending on how long it was out of range, if it was out of range at all. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, I think so. I answered it to my satisfaction, certainly. Our next question then is, how does DTP interact with the IRT system in place for the study?
So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but, you wouldn't want patient information to be widely available to anybody or accidentally get out into the web where it shouldn't be. So the IRT really should be set up based on patient number and no identifying either health information or addresses, phone numbers, fax numbers, email address, and so on do not need to be included in there. And through the pharmacy can get the patient's name, address, date of birth, and so on to be able to complete that shipment and address it with the carrier.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can we guarantee we follow regulations such as GDPR in terms of maintaining patients' confidential information?
So I think I may have just answered that one by accident, but basically all patient confidential information should remain between the doctor and the pharmacy in the case of a pharmacy model, so that the IVR, the carrier obviously is going to have a patient's name and address, but even that is blinded to most of the population within the carrier's staff, so that only the person that needs to know it has it. And obviously HIPAA training, GDPR training for any staff involved in all of that. But the idea here is to keep that patient information out of the hands of anybody that doesn't need it and only give it to the people who do, such as the carrier who's going to deliver that last leg of the shipment and the pharmacy, and obviously the doctor.
Thank you. The next question is, how have you managed drug accountability on the DTP trials?
So either through the clinical site, if there is one, or back to the returns vendor that can do the accountability. So basically the same way you would in the traditional model, except it may not go back to the site first. It may go back right to the vendor for accountability. Plus, we can do it via the home health care provider if there is one, or via telemedicine visits with the study staff, and so on. So there's many different ways to accomplish that, but definitely not impossible.
We have another question on accountability here, which says, can you also collect returns and assess compliance?
Yes. Yes, so obviously it would need to be set up with the returns vendor and the level of accountability and returns and reconciliation that you desire. But yes, it shouldn't be any different than how you would do it in a traditional model.
Okay, the next question then is, how do you ensure security of supplies?
So again, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, Nick, but basically it's never left on the doorstep, and it's only delivered to an authorized representative by checking ID and so on.
Okay, and this one may also cover ground that we've touched on, but what kind of training does the company delivering the IMP need to have?
So obviously within the U.S., HIPAA and PHI have to be fully aware of what's allowed and what's not. And the protocol model itself and the way that it is set up and, anything that they need to know at the time of delivery should be pre-trained, and drivers should be trained. And from what I understand for the carriers, it's pretty generic training, but if need be, they are also trained specifically on a certain protocol. Obviously not the protocol and medical advice, but anything they would need to know at time of delivery. And that's all done up front. So there's a lot of planning and discussion, obviously, that need to go into all of this, but well worth it in the end. Yeah, Nick, sorry.
Thanks for that. And our next question is, can Catalent ship DTP to all U.S. states?
Yes, we will be able to ship to all U.S. states and territories.
Good to know. Our next question then is, how and by whom is delivery confirmed into the IVR system for DTP?
So that could be set up multiple different ways, and obviously would be dependent on how your protocol is set up. But for the most part, from what I understand, what a lot of people are doing is when the patient receives their shipment, they have a predetermined slot that they check in with their clinical site that they've received the drug. Everything looks good. It's not damaged. It's within range, and the site makes that phone call to the IBR. But
okay,
I don't think that there's
Sorry.
Any one way to do it. So it would depend on how you want to set it up.
Right. And our next question is, what kind of approval is needed to courier have access to personal patient data?
So the patient, from as I understand, the patient would sign a consent form, and it would allow at that point in time the carrier and other third-party vendors to have access to the patient's information, such as the pharmacy, so the patient's fully aware that, if they're accepting, home shipments, that obviously the carrier is going to need to know where they live and who to deliver it to.
Okay, thank you. We've got another one here that may touch on some ground we've covered, but how do you avoid unblinding risks when patient information, such as name and address, and clinical supplies have to be shared with the delivery system?
So I think there's two ways to look at unblinding. Unblinding of the patient's name and PHI, or unblinding of the drug. So I'm not sure I'm following the question completely, but the blinded drug is still shipped as blinded drug. So there's no need to unblind what the drug is unless there's an emergency, obviously, within the pharmacy. So the pharmacist will know what they're shipping, but only the pharmacist will know. And the only reason they would even know that is because they have access to the randomization and the protocol. But they're basically delivering what the doctor is requesting, and that would be done by kit number. Hopefully that answered. Otherwise, I can follow up some more.
Yep. And next question then is, during which phase of clinical development is DTP most valuable or used most often?
I don't think that there's really a right or wrong answer there. Obviously, the larger trials, it's going to help recruit patients on a much wider level and hopefully speed things up, make it more efficient for everybody involved. I don't know that there's really any one answer to that question, at least not in my experience.
So thank you for that. This will be my next question will be our final question. We had a lot of great questions today, and if we didn't get to yours or we didn't answer it as you want, we'll try and get back to everyone who submitted them personally after the webinar. So the final question is, what are the limitations of DTP?
Limitations. I'm not really sure how to answer that one. So I think that as long as you keep an open mind, and obviously outside of the U.S., you would obviously need to convince the authorities that your protocol and patient safety is obviously the utmost importance and that the patient population would benefit from it. I don't really know that there are limits. There are challenges, of course, but I wouldn't say there are limits. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and particularly for submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank Nicole for participating and Catalent for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.